Legendary rock guitarist Brian May has received a knighthood from King Charles. May is a founding member of the iconic band Queen. He will now be known as Sir Brian.
In what has become one of the most shocking and controversial legal cases in recent music history, Brian Harold May, the legendary guitarist of the rock band Queen, has found himself at the center of an unprecedented legal battle that culminated in a sentence that has stunned fans worldwide. The guitarist, astrophysicist, and animal rights activist, known for his distinctive sound and homemade red special guitar, has been ensnared in a complex legal situation that has raised questions about justice, historical accountability, and the intersection of art and controversy. The case began unassumingly enough 3 years ago, with what appeared to be a routine investigation into historical property transactions in Surrey, England. May, who had purchased several adjoining properties over the decades to create a wildlife sanctuary as part of his animal conservation efforts, came under scrutiny when researchers examining historical land registry documents discovered irregularities dating back to the early 1980s. What started as a civil inquiry quickly escalated when investigators uncovered a trail of documentation suggesting that a portion of May's extensive property had a complicated and potentially problematic history. According to court records, certain parcels of land incorporated into his estate had changed hands multiple times under suspicious circumstances before May acquired them in 1985, during the height of Queen's commercial success. The investigation revealed that the land had previously belonged to a historical trust with connections to a notorious art collector who had fled Europe in the late 1940s. This collector had been implicated in the acquisition of artworks and properties with disputed provenance during the turbulent period following World War II. Although many of these connections were tenuous and separated by decades from May's purchase, prosecutors built a case around the theory that May had been aware of the problematic history when acquiring the property. The most damning evidence came in the form of a previously undiscovered letter, allegedly written by May to his financial advisors in 1985, acknowledging potential historical complications with the property but suggesting they proceed regardless, as sufficient time has passed to obscure any problematic chains of ownership. The authenticity of this document became a central point of contention throughout the trial, with May's defense team consistently maintaining it was either a forgery or had been misinterpreted when taken out of context. The case took a dramatic turn when prosecutors expanded their investigation beyond the property transactions to include items in May's extensive collection of historical artifacts, particularly focusing on several Victorian-era astronomical instruments and rare scientific manuscripts that the guitarist had acquired through various auctions and private sales throughout his career. Investigators alleged that several pieces had been illegally exported from their countries of origin before eventually finding their way into May's collection. May's initial response was one of shocked cooperation. "These accusations are completely unfounded," he stated in an early press release. "I've spent my life creating music, advancing science, and protecting wildlife. I've always conducted my affairs with transparency and ethical consideration." He voluntarily opened his records to investigators and expressed confidence that any misunderstandings would be quickly resolved. However, as the investigation progressed, the case became increasingly complex. What had begun as an inquiry into property transactions expanded to encompass alleged financial irregularities related to May's numerous conservation charities. Prosecutors suggested that certain donations had been misdirected, with funds ostensibly earmarked for wildlife protection projects allegedly being used to acquire additional historical items for May's personal collection. Throughout the pretrial proceedings, legal experts expressed skepticism about the strength of the prosecution's case. Many pointed out that the alleged offenses were separated from May by multiple transactions and decades, making his direct knowledge or culpability highly questionable. Others noted the unusual aggressiveness with which prosecutors were pursuing the case, leading to speculation about potential political motivations or attempts to make an example of a high-profile figure. The trial itself, which began 14 months ago, quickly became a media sensation. May arrived at court each day, accompanied by his wife, actress Anita Dobson, both maintaining a dignified silence in the face of the growing media circus. Inside the courtroom, May's defense team methodically challenged the prosecution's evidence, bringing in handwriting experts who questioned the authenticity of the damning 1985 letter and presenting documentation showing that May had conducted due diligence before each acquisition. The prosecution, however, painted a picture of a collector whose passion had crossed into obsession, leading him to overlook or deliberately ignore red flags regarding the provenance of both properties and artifacts. They presented testimony from former associates who claimed May had been warned about potential issues, but had proceeded with acquisitions nonetheless. These witnesses became controversial figures in their own right, with the defense suggesting they were either mistaken or motivated by personal grievances against the guitarist. As the trial progressed, the focus increasingly shifted from the original property transactions to May's collection of scientific artifacts. Prosecutors presented evidence suggesting that several key pieces, including a rare 18th century celestial atlas and a collection of astronomical instruments, had been illegally exported from their countries of origin during periods of political instability before being sold through a series of dealers who had obscured their provenance. The defense countered with extensive documentation showing May's careful research into the history of each item in his collection, and presented evidence that he had often gone beyond legal requirements in attempting to verify the ethical provenance of his acquisitions. They also highlighted his history of donating significant items to museums and educational institutions, arguing this was hardly the behavior of someone attempting to hoard illegally obtained treasures. Public opinion largely remained on May's side throughout the trial. Fellow musicians, scientists, and conservationists spoke out in his defense, highlighting his decades of ethical behavior and contributions to multiple fields. Queen bandmate Roger Taylor called the proceedings a travesty of justice and a pathetic attempt to tarnish the legacy of one of the most decent human beings I've ever known. Guitarist Slash described the case as beyond belief, while renowned primatologist Jane Goodall questioned why someone with May's record of conservation work was being targeted while genuine environmental criminals walk free. The prosecution's case suffered several setbacks as the trial continued. Two key witnesses recanted portions of their testimony, admitting they had overstated May's knowledge of potential issues with certain acquisitions. Forensic analysis of the controversial 1985 letter raised additional questions about its authenticity, with experts testifying that both the paper and ink contained elements inconsistent with the purported date of creation. Despite these developments, the case proceeded to its conclusion. After nearly 7 months of testimony, closing arguments were presented to a jury that had been sequestered due to the high-profile nature of the case. The deliberations lasted an unprecedented 11 days, suggesting significant disagreement among jury members. The verdict, when finally announced, sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond. May was found guilty on multiple counts, including knowingly acquiring property with disputed provenance, financial irregularities related to his charitable foundations, and possession of cultural artifacts illegally removed from their countries of origin. The conviction came despite what many legal observers considered significant reasonable doubt. The sentencing phase that followed was equally controversial. Prosecutors argued for a sentence that would send a message about the seriousness of cultural property crimes, regardless of the defendant's status or previous contributions to society. May's defense team presented hundreds of character witnesses and detailed his lifetime of positive contributions to music, science, animal welfare, and philanthropy. When the sentence was announced, life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 20 years, the courtroom erupted in disbelief. May, then 77 years old, stood impassively as the sentence was read, though Anita Dobson collapsed and had to be assisted by courtroom staff. Outside, fans who had gathered in support broke into spontaneous renditions of Queen songs, many openly weeping as news of the severe sentence spread. Legal experts immediately condemned the verdict and sentence as disproportionate and potentially influenced by factors beyond the evidence presented. May's legal team announced plans to appeal, citing numerous grounds including questionable evidence, potential jury intimidation, and the extraordinary harshness of the sentence compared to similar cases. In the days following the sentencing, public support for May intensified. Benefit concerts were organized, with proceeds going to his legal defense fund. Petitions calling for his release garnered millions of signatures within days. Fellow Queen bandmate Roger Taylor appeared on multiple news programs, visibly emotional as he defended his friend of over 5 decades. "This isn't justice," Taylor stated during one particularly poignant interview. "This is persecution of a good man who has given more to this world than most of us could in 10 lifetimes." The appeal process began immediately, with May's team filing multiple motions challenging both the verdict and the sentence. They presented new evidence suggesting that the prosecution had withheld potentially exculpatory information and raised concerns about procedural irregularities throughout the trial. Independent legal experts reviewing the case increasingly expressed alarm at what many were now describing as a severe miscarriage of justice. As the appeal moved forward, May was transferred to a minimum security facility in recognition of his age and the non-violent nature of his alleged offenses. Reports from those few visitors permitted to see him described a man focused on remaining positive despite the circumstances. He had apparently been granted permission to have a guitar in his cell and was continuing to write music. "Even in the darkest circumstances, Brian finds light in creativity," Anita Dobson told reporters after her first visit. The case took another dramatic turn 6 months into May's incarceration, when investigative journalists uncovered evidence suggesting that the prosecution may have been influenced by powerful individuals with interests in acquiring portions of May's property for development. Documentation emerged indicating that proposals for a major commercial development had been drawn up for the area encompassing May's wildlife sanctuary, with preliminary approval contingent upon the land becoming available. This revelation sparked renewed scrutiny of the entire case. Legal observers who had previously been hesitant to suggest corruption began openly questioning whether May had been targeted specifically to facilitate access to his environmentally significant landholdings. Conservation organizations pointed out that May's property provided critical habitat for endangered species and served as an important wildlife corridor. Exactly the type of property frequently targeted by developers. Additional questions arose regarding the handling of May's scientific collection following his conviction. Rather than being repatriated to the countries the prosecution had claimed were their rightful owners, many pieces had been placed in the custody of private institutions with connections to the same development interests that had allegedly influenced the case. This apparent conflict of interest added fuel to the growing perception that the prosecution had been motivated by factors beyond simple justice. The appeal process gained momentum as new evidence continued to emerge. 3 of the jurors from the original trial came forward with affidavits stating they had felt pressured to deliver a guilty verdict despite their personal doubts about May's culpability. Forensic experts presented new analyses of the key 1985 letter, providing compelling evidence that it had been created much more recently and artificially aged to appear authentic. International pressure also began to mount. Musicians, scientists, and political figures from around the world spoke out against what was increasingly being characterized as a politically motivated prosecution. Several countries whose cultural artifacts were allegedly involved issued statements indicating they had never sought repatriation of items in May's collection and had considered his stewardship of historical scientific instruments to be appropriate and ethical. 14 months after May's imprisonment, the appellate court issued its ruling. In a scathing opinion that ran to over 100 pages, the 3-judge panel overturned both the conviction and sentence, citing egregious prosecutorial misconduct, fundamentally flawed evidence, and a sentence so disproportionate as to shock the conscience of the court. The judges took the unusual step of barring any attempt to retry May on the same or similar charges, effectively ending the legal proceeding. May was released the same day, emerging from the correctional facility to find thousands of supporters gathered outside. In a brief statement delivered with characteristic dignity, he thanked those who had stood by him and expressed his intention to continue his work in music, science, and conservation. "What sustains us through darkness is the light of truth and the warmth of human connection," he told the assembled crowd. "I've been fortunate to experience both in abundance, even in the most challenging circumstances." The aftermath of the case brought significant changes. Investigations were launched into the conduct of the prosecution team and the influences that may have shaped their unusually aggressive approach. Several officials resigned as evidence of improper communications with development interests came to light. The proposed commercial development that would have encroached on May's wildlife sanctuary was permanently shelved following intense public scrutiny. For May himself, the experience, while traumatic, became a platform for advocacy. In the years following his release, he became a prominent voice for criminal justice reform, highlighting the vulnerabilities in a system that could be manipulated to target individuals regardless of the actual evidence against them. He established a foundation to provide legal assistance to those wrongfully convicted who lacked the resources and public support that had facilitated his own exoneration. His scientific and conservation work also took on new dimensions. The threatened wildlife sanctuary that had been at the center of the case was expanded and granted permanent protected status, ensuring it would remain a haven for endangered species, regardless of future development pressures. May also donated significant portions of his historical scientific collection to public institutions, with transparent documentation of provenance and acquisition history. Musically, the experience influenced his creative output as well. 18 months after his release, Queen with Adam Lambert embarked on a world tour that broke attendance records, with portions of the proceeds supporting both environmental causes and criminal justice reform initiatives. May also released a solo album that critics described as his most powerful and personal work, with themes of resilience, truth, and redemption resonating throughout the compositions. Legal experts continue to study the case as an example of how fame and wealth provide no immunity against prosecutorial overreach when significant economic or political interests are involved. Law schools have incorporated the case into their curricula as a cautionary tale about the potential for the justice system to be weaponized against individuals who stand in the way of powerful interests. For fans who had followed May's career from Queen's early days through his scientific achievements and conservation work, the case represented a dark chapter in an otherwise inspiring life story. Many expressed that their admiration for him had only deepened, seeing how he had faced adversity with the same grace and determination that had characterized his approach to music, science, and advocacy throughout his life. May himself has rarely spoken about the details of his ordeal in the years since, preferring to focus on the positive changes that emerged from the experience. When asked in a rare interview about how he maintained his composure throughout the process, he responded with characteristic thoughtfulness. "The universe operates on timescales that make our human dramas seem very small indeed. Looking at the stars reminds us that truth has a permanence that transcends temporary injustice. I never doubted that eventually the light would break through." The legacy of the case continues to evolve. Documentaries and books have examined the intersection of environmental protection, cultural property, and justice that it represented. Legal reforms, inspired in part by the revealed abuses, have strengthened protections against similar manipulations of the justice system. The wildlife sanctuary at the heart of the case has become a model for private conservation initiatives, demonstrating how individual commitment can preserve critical habitat in the face of development pressure. For Brian May, guitarist, astrophysicist, animal advocate, and briefly prisoner, the experience became simply another chapter in a multifaceted life dedicated to creativity, knowledge, and compassion. While the sensationalist headlines once proclaimed, "Brian May sentenced to life imprisonment," the true story that emerged was one of resilience, the power of public support, and the ultimate triumph of truth over manipulation and injustice. Today, visitors to May's wildlife sanctuary are often unaware of the legal battle that once threatened its existence. They see only the thriving ecosystem, the recovered endangered species, and occasionally, its famous owner walking the paths with guitar or camera in hand, continuing his lifelong practice of finding harmony in both music and nature. It stands as perhaps the most appropriate monument to a case that attempted to silence one of music's most distinctive voices, but instead amplified his message of conservation and compassion.